welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep into a topic that should be right up your alley. As a philosophy enthusiast, we're going to tackle creationism, and the whole debate with evolutionary science. And to really dig in, we're using this super in-depth article from, get this, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It gets into some seriously thought-provoking stuff, let me tell you.
Yeah, and one of the things that's really interesting from the get-go is that, the term creationism itself, it can be a bit slippery. It's kind of used in a lot of different ways. So, for this deep dive, we gotta, be super precise.
Yeah, for sure. Because just believing in a God who, created the universe, that's not the same as the kind of creationism that's usually at the heart of, all these debates and controversies.
Exactly. You got it. We're zeroing in on a particular type of creationism, the kind that really digs its heels in on a literal reading of the Bible, specifically the book of Genesis. And that's where we see these, head-on collisions with evolutionary science.
So we're talking about like the 6 days of creation, a young earth, Garden of Eden, Noah's Ark, that whole deal.
Yep, exactly. And this is where it gets kind of juicy, especially for a philosopher. You see, this insistence on a literal interpretation, it's not like some ancient, unchanging Christian doctrine. It's actually like a relatively recent thing, especially big in America.
Really? That's kind of surprising. I always figured that creationism was, like deeply rooted in Christian history, going way back.
Well, yeah, the belief in God as the creator is definitely a core part of Christianity. But this super strict, literalist way of reading the Bible, the way we see it now, it really gained traction much later. Catholic theologians, even way back to Augustine, they were already talking about the need for metaphorical and allegorical interpretations of Scripture.
So when did this whole literalist view really start to take hold?
Well, it kind of started emerging after the Protestant Reformation, picked up steam in the 18th and 19th centuries, especially during those big religious revivals. And then in America, after the Civil War, it got really deeply embedded in certain evangelical communities, particularly in the South.
So this rise of biblical literalism, it kind of set the stage for that big clash with evolutionary theory, which was gaining a lot of scientific momentum around the same time, right?
Spot on. And that clash has played out on a bunch of major battlegrounds. And each of those has its own, philosophical baggage.
All right, let's jump into those battlegrounds then. One of the biggest ones got to be the age of the earth, right? Creationists, based on their reading of Genesis, are adamant about a young earth, just a few thousand years old.
Right. But then you've got evolutionary science using all that geological and astronomical evidence to point to an earth that's billions of years old. That difference in timescales is huge. It's fundamental to the whole debate.
It's not just about the numbers, though, right? There are deeper philosophical questions here about, time, change, and even what reality is.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder about, different ways of knowing and how reliable they are. Can we really trust, a super literal interpretation of ancient texts? Or should we be putting more weight on empirical evidence and scientific methods when we try to make sense of the natural world? That's a big one for philosophers.
And then, of course, we've got that whole flashpoint with the fossil record.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. Creationists often say that the fossil record, with all its apparent gaps and the sudden appearances of new species, it actually backs up this idea of, a sudden creation, even a global flood.
So they're saying the layers of fossils, they aren't a record of gradual evolution over millions of years, but they're actually evidence of some catastrophic event like Noah's flood, which just kind of dumped everything there all at once.
That's the gist, yeah. They're saying that the order we see, simpler organisms lower down and then more complex ones higher up, that reflects, the order in which they got wiped out by the flood.
But hold on, wouldn't we be finding, human fossils mixed in with dinosaur bones if a global flood really dumped them all at the same time? And evolutionary scientists have some strong counter-arguments too, right?
Absolutely. Those distinct fossil layers with their clear progression through time, that lines up way better with the idea of gradual evolution over, incredibly long periods. Paleontologists have tons of documented transitional fossils that show species evolving step by step.
And there's also that thing about fossilization being, a super rare event, which would explain those gaps that creationists always point to.
Exactly. You need really specific conditions for fossilization to happen, so it's not a shock that we don't have a complete fossil record for every single species. But what we do have tells this really clear story about evolutionary change over time.
It's interesting, though, how Creationists are okay with a certain type of evolution, what they call microevolution. But when it comes to macroevolution, the idea of common descent, that's where they draw the line.
Yeah, that distinction is super important to their argument. They might be fine with, like, small changes within a species, like bacteria developing resistance to antibiotics, but they say, nope, that's where it ends. This whole idea that all life came from a single ancestor, that's a no-go for them.
It's like they're saying there's a wall between these kinds, as they put it, a wall that evolution just can't get over.
Right. And for a philosopher, that brings up some really cool questions about, how we categorize things in nature, where the boundaries are. Are these kinds real objective categories, or are they just things we've made up, to make sense of this super interconnected web of life?
And then there's another big sticking point, natural selection. Creationists often say that random mutations just can't lead to the incredible complexity we see in life. It's like, saying a monkey randomly hitting keys on a typewriter could write Shakespeare.
That argument kind of misses the point about how natural selection really works. I mean, yeah, mutations happen randomly. It's not like an organism can just decide, hey, I need a mutation. But natural selection, that acts like a filter, a really powerful one.
So it's not just random chance at play. If a mutation is beneficial, if it helps an organism survive and reproduce, then it's more likely to be passed down to the next generation.
That's it. Think of it like building something complex step by step. You keep the pieces that fit, toss the ones that don't. Over time, this whole process of selection can lead to these incredibly intricate adaptations.
It's wild how this seemingly blind process can lead to such elegant and functional designs.
It is, isn't it? And for a philosopher, this raises some seriously deep questions about design itself. Can design really emerge from a process that doesn't involve, like, a conscious designer? Can you get order from what looks like randomness?
Those are questions that have kept philosophers busy for centuries, way before Darwin came along.
Totally. And the theory of evolution, it's added this whole new dimension to those questions. It makes us rethink what we thought we knew about purpose in nature, about the idea that everything's leading toward a specific goal.
Speaking of challenging traditional ideas, I got to bring up the Scopes monkey trial. That iconic image, the courtroom in 1925, debating evolution versus creation.
Oh, yeah, the Scopes trial. It really put the debate on everyone's radar, even though it was more about whether it was legal to teach evolution, not so much about which side had the better science.
And even though, the evolutionists technically won in court, the cultural and philosophical battle, that was far from over.
For sure. The Scopes trial was a turning point. It showed how deeply divided people were, socially and philosophically, and those divisions are still around today.
It also shows how science gets tangled up with politics and social agendas. That's got to be fascinating for a philosopher like you.
Oh, absolutely. The Scopes trial and these ongoing debates about evolution, they remind us that science never happens in a vacuum. There's always a social context, and people interpret its implications through their own cultural and political beliefs. You can't escape that.
And the creationist movement didn't just disappear after Scopes, did it? It came back even stronger in the 1960s with creation science.
You're right. The publication of the Genesis flood in 1961, that was a huge moment. It was like they were trying to use science to back up a literal reading of Genesis, saying modern science actually proved the Bible right.
It's like they were fighting fire with fire, using the language and methods of science to defend their religious beliefs.
Exactly. And that raises some really interesting philosophical questions about the line between science and pseudoscience. Can you just call religious beliefs science by, like, throwing in some scientific terms or picking and choosing studies that support your view?
That's a dangerous game, right? It's like saying astrology is science because it uses astronomical observations.
Exactly. You have to look deeper at the methods, how solid the evidence is, and whether they're willing to change their minds if new discoveries come up.
Okay, so let's dig into some of the specific things they argued in the Genesis flood.
Hmm.
For example, they said a global flood could explain the fossil record, with those different lawyers representing the order in which animals got, wiped out by the rising water.
Yeah, that's their flood geology model. But, as we said before, it's got some serious holes. If you look closely at the fossil record, it doesn't actually support this idea of a single flood dumping all these creatures at the same time.
And there's the whole issue of, like, the physics of a flood that big. Where did all that water come from? And where did it go afterward?
Good questions. The flood model raises more questions than it answers. Geologists and paleontologists have pretty much debunked it.
Another thing they argued was that the second law of thermodynamics, the one about entropy or disorder increasing over time, makes evolution impossible. They claim that life getting more complex actually breaks that law.
That argument, it's another example of misusing scientific principles. The second law applies to closed systems, but Earth, it's an open system. It's constantly getting energy from the sun.
So it's like saying a refrigerator can't make things cold because that breaks the second law, when really it's just moving heat around using energy from outside to do it.
Precisely. Life on Earth uses the sun's energy to create order and complexity locally, even if the overall entropy of the universe is increasing. It's all about the nuances. You can't just pick and choose which scientific laws to use to fit your preconceived ideas.
And that's where the philosophy comes in, right? Thinking critically, understanding the limits of different ways of knowing, and seeing when scientific concepts are being, twisted or misused.
Absolutely. And it brings us to another huge moment for creation science, the Arkansas trial in 1981. This is where they literally put the definition of science itself on trial.
The Arkansas trial. Oh, yeah, I think I remember reading about that. Didn't creationists try to force schools to teach creation science alongside evolution?
Yep. They push for balanced treatment, saying creation science was just as legitimate as evolution and deserved equal time in classrooms. But the whole case boiled down to one question. Could creation science even be considered science?
And what was the verdict?
The judge, William Overton, said, nope, creation science is religion, not science. So because of the separation of church and state, it couldn't be taught in public schools.
That must have been a big blow to the creation science movement.
It was. Judge Overton, when he gave his ruling, he laid out 5 essential characteristics of science. And he said creation science didn't meet any of them.
I'm curious, what were those characteristics? How did he define what science is?
First, he said science is all about natural law. It looks for explanations based on things we can observe and test, not on miracles or the supernatural.
So no miracles allowed in science.
Not as scientific explanations, no.
Yeah.
Second, Overton said science has to be testable against the real world. You got to be able to verify its claims through observation or experiment.
Makes sense. You can't just make stuff up.
Right. Third, he said scientific conclusions are always tentative, meaning they can change if new evidence comes out.
So science is about always learning and updating our understanding, not clinging to dogma.
Exactly. Fourth, science has to be falsifiable. There's got to be a way to prove it wrong, at least in theory.
That's interesting. It's about being open to being wrong, which seems kind of weird, but it's key for science to move forward.
It is. And last, Judge Overton said that scientific explanations have to stick to natural law. They can't rely on supernatural forces or interventions.
So even though creationists try to use fancy scientific language, the judge saw through that and said their core beliefs were religious, not scientific.
That's it. The Arkansas trial and Judge Overton's ruling set a legal precedent, making it clear that creation science, at least how it was defined then, couldn't be taught in public schools because it violated the separation of church and state.
It's amazing how a court case about education turned into a debate about what science even is.
It is, and it shows how important philosophy is for clarifying concepts and analyzing arguments, even in a debate that's often presented as just science versus religion.
And for you as a philosopher, there's a lot to unpack there. Like Judge Overton emphasizing falsifiability, that sounds a lot like Karl Popper, that famous philosopher of science.
Definitely. Popper said that to be considered scientific, an idea has to have a way to potentially be proven wrong. That's his idea of falsifiability, and it's been really influential in defining the boundaries of science.
But hasn't that idea been challenged too? Do all philosophers agree that being falsifiable is the ultimate test for what's considered science?
That's a great question. There's actually a whole debate going on among philosophers about whether falsifiability is a clear-cut way to separate science from non-science.
So the line between science and non-science might be blurrier than we sometimes think.
Some philosophers think so. They say there might be things we can know that are legitimate and valuable but don't fit neatly into Popper's idea.
It's fascinating how these philosophical debates about knowledge end up having real-world consequences, like in court cases about what can be taught in schools.
It really does. The Arkansas trial and all the philosophical discussions it started, they show how important philosophy is for shaping how we understand science, religion, and how they fit into society.
And the Arkansas trial wasn't the end, was it?
Mhm.
Creationists didn't just give up after losing in court.
Nope, they didn't. After that legal setback, they kind of shifted gears. They started focusing more on the philosophy behind the debate, and people like Philip Johnson really led that charge.
Oh, Philip Johnson. He's a big name in the intelligent design movement, right?
Mhm.
His book, Darwin on Trial, really brought the philosophical arguments against evolution into the spotlight.
You got it. Johnson argues that the fight isn't just about scientific evidence, it's about different ways of seeing the world. He claims that evolutionary theory, because it relies on what's called methodological naturalism, inevitably leads to metaphysical naturalism, which is a philosophy that basically denies anything exists beyond the natural world.
So Johnson's saying that even if you believe in God, accepting evolution will ultimately lead you down a path to atheism.
That's one way to put it. He's essentially saying that if you buy into the methods of science, looking for natural explanations for things, you're automatically shutting the door on God or anything supernatural.
But can't you accept the methods of science and still have religious beliefs? I mean, tons of scientists are religious, and they don't seem to have a problem reconciling their faith with their scientific work.
That's a huge point of disagreement. Johnson would say that those scientists are either keeping their science and religion totally separate, or they're kind of doing some mental gymnastics to make two fundamentally incompatible worldviews fit together.
It seems like he's giving people a false choice, science or religion, when maybe there are other ways to understand how they relate to each other.
That's what a lot of philosophers and theologians say about Johnson. They argue that you can accept the methods of science without having to believe that nothing exists beyond the natural world.
So you can believe that science is the best way to understand the natural world. But that doesn't mean you have to deny that a supernatural realm or divine action exists.
Exactly. Methodological naturalism, which is basically the approach science uses to look for natural explanations for natural things, doesn't automatically mean you have to believe that nothing exists beyond the natural world.
It sounds like Johnson's mixing up the methods we use to study the world with what we conclude about the ultimate nature of reality.
That's a really important point, and it's something we need to explore more when we get into intelligent design theory and how it tries to bridge the gap between science and religion.
That sounds like a perfect place to pick up in the next part of our deep dive. This is
Mhm.
getting really interesting.
Welcome back to our deep dive into creationism. So, we were talking about Philip Johnson and how his critique of evolution goes beyond the science and gets into these big philosophical questions, like the nature of science and what it means for believing in God.
Yeah, his argument is that accepting evolution, even if you're religious, eventually leads to atheism. But is that really true? I mean, does it have to be that way?
Well, that's where things get super interesting, especially, for someone who's into philosophy. Like, one thing about Johnson, he doesn't really seem to engage with all the different theological arguments that people have made to try to fit evolution within, like, a Christian framework.
Oh, you mean like how theologians have tried to bridge that gap between evolution and Christian beliefs? Tell me more about that. What are some ways they've tried to do that?
Well, one way is to see miracles as exceptions to natural law, like moments where God directly steps in and does something. This lets you accept evolution as, the usual way life develops, but still leaves room for God to act in specific cases.
So it's like God set up the universe with the laws of physics, and evolution is how those laws play out in biology, but God can still do miracles when he wants to.
Exactly. Another way is to reinterpret miracles as natural events that, we just don't understand scientifically yet. So instead of seeing them as like supernatural stuff, maybe we'll eventually find natural explanations for them.
So like the parting of the Red Sea could have been a super rare tidal thing, or the burning bush was caused by some weird atmospheric condition we haven't figured out yet.
That's the idea. It's about recognizing that we don't know everything yet. And what seems like a miracle now might have a perfectly natural explanation once we know more.
But I'm sure some theologians would say that trying to explain miracles with science is just like a fundamental mistake.
Yeah, for sure. They'd say that miracles are on a different level of reality. They're not the kind of thing you can study scientifically, like physical stuff. They're more about spiritual truths than about empirical events.
So trying to analyze a miracle scientifically would be like dissecting a poem to understand how it makes you feel. The wrong tool for the job.
Exactly. It's about different ways of understanding reality. Science, which is all about natural explanations, might not be the best way to understand religious experiences or spiritual stuff.
But Johnson doesn't seem to allow for any of those other interpretations, right?
Yeah.
He's stuck on a literal reading of Genesis, which puts him at odds not just with evolution, but also with a lot of Christian thought.
That's one of the problems with his argument. He makes it seem like it's either biblical literalism or atheism, with no room for all the different theological ideas that have been around for centuries, trying to figure out how faith and reason fit together.
And this brings us to intelligent design, which tries to be this like more sophisticated alternative to both creationism and Darwinian evolution.
Right. Intelligent design, while it has some things in common with creationism, especially in rejecting purely natural explanations, it often tries to avoid mentioning the Bible or a young Earth.
One of the main guys in intelligent design is Michael Behe, right? He's famous for his argument about irreducible complexity,
Mm.
using the bacterial flagellum as his big example.
Yeah. Behe's argument is that some biological systems are so complex, with so many parts that depend on each other, that they couldn't have evolved gradually through natural selection. He says they must have been designed all at once, as a complete unit.
It's like a mousetrap where every part has to be there and working for it to function.
Yeah.
Take away one piece and the whole thing is useless.
Exactly. B says the bacterial flagellum, that little whip-like thing that helps some bacteria move around, it's like a tiny outboard motor with all these intricate parts working together. And he says this level of complexity means there has to be a designer.
But haven't evolutionary biologists shown how complex systems can evolve step by step?
They have. They point out that natural selection can repurpose existing structures and processes to do new things. It's like someone taking parts from an old radio and using them to build a new gadget. Evolution doesn't have to invent everything from scratch. It can modify and repurpose what's already there.
Oh yeah, like the Krebs cycle, that really complex metabolic pathway in cells that makes energy. It's a multi-step process with all these enzymes, but it turns out each part of the cycle was already doing something else and got gradually co-opted for energy production.
The Krebs cycle is a perfect example of how evolution can build complexity by, tinkering with existing stuff. It's totally different from the top-down design that Behe's talking about.
It seems like Behe's argument is kind of like that God of the gaps thing,
Mm-hmm.
where anything we don't understand scientifically right now must be the work of a designer.
Yeah, that's a common criticism.
Yeah.
And it shows why it's important to remember that scientific knowledge is always changing. Just because we don't have a detailed explanation for how something evolved yet doesn't mean there isn't a natural explanation.
And another problem with Behe's argument is like the timing of this supposed design. If these irreducibly complex systems were designed billions of years ago, wouldn't the genes for them have mutated a bunch by now, maybe even stopped working?
That's a tough one for Behe's model. If the designer did everything up front and then just left it alone, those genes that aren't being used would be vulnerable to random mutations and they could break down over time.
So to keep these design systems working, you'd need a designer who's constantly stepping in, fixing things, and making adjustments.
That's what it would take. But then you run into the problem of, bad design. If there's a good and powerful designer who's actively involved, why is there so much imperfection and suffering in nature?
That's a question that's bothered theologians forever. Why would a good God allow so much pain? Intelligent design, even though it claims to be scientific, doesn't really have an answer for that.
It doesn't. And it shows the limits of trying to explain all the complexity and diversity of life just through the idea of design. Evolution, with its mix of chance and necessity, might be a more complete and satisfying explanation, even though it raises its own philosophical questions.
Speaking of philosophical questions, William Dembski is another important figure in intelligent design. He tries to address the problem of bad design with his explanatory filter.
Right. Dembski's explanatory filter is supposed to help us figure out whether something is best explained by natural law, by chance, or by design.
So it's like a tool for deciding whether something was probably caused by natural processes or by a designer's intentions.
Exactly. He says design things have three main characteristics: contingency, complexity, and specification.
Okay, break those down for me. What do those mean in this context?
So contingency means the thing doesn't just exist because of natural laws. It's not something that had to be that way based on, physics or chemistry.
So it's not like gravity, which is just a fundamental law of nature. It's more like a specific arrangement of things that could have been different.
Exactly. Complexity means it's super unlikely, not something that could just happen by chance.
Yeah, okay, I get that. And what about specification?
Specification means it follows a pre-existing pattern, like there was a plan for it.
Yeah. So like a random string of letters is complex, but it's not specified. But a sonnet by Shakespeare is both complex and specified because it follows a pattern, a structure that suggests someone planned it out.
That's a great example. And Dembski would say something like the bacterial flagellum, with its intricate parts and its specific job, it fits all three criteria, which means it must be designed.
But Is this filter really that reliable? Can we really separate design from chance and natural law so neatly? I mean, couldn't a designer work through natural processes using evolution to achieve certain goals?
That's a major criticism of Dembski's filter. It assumes that design, law, and chance are completely separate, and that's a pretty questionable assumption.
It's like saying a sculptor can only make a statue by chipping away at a block of marble. They couldn't use a mold or a 3D printer, even though those methods still involve design and intention.
Exactly. This idea that design always has to be top-down, imposed from outside, it's a limited way of thinking that doesn't really appreciate how creative natural processes can be.
So even if we say, okay, some things in nature are complex and specified, that doesn't automatically mean they were designed in the way Dembski thinks.
Right. And it shows how important it is to understand the nuances of these philosophical arguments. Just because something looks designed doesn't mean it was designed by, like, a conscious being in a way that fits traditional religious beliefs.
It seems like intelligent design, even though it says it's a scientific theory, is still really based on theological ideas about the designer and the purpose of creation.
I think that's fair to say, and it's one reason why a lot of scientists and philosophers are skeptical of it.
It's funny how this whole debate always comes back to the question of, like, what's science and what's religion?
It does, and it's a question with huge implications for education, law, and even how we see ourselves and our place in the universe.
We've covered a ton in this deep dive. We've talked about the history of creationism, its main arguments, the legal battles, and the philosophical stuff underneath it all.
Yeah, we've seen how this debate isn't just about science or religion. It's about worldviews, values, and those big questions humans have been asking forever.
It makes us question what we think we know about knowledge, belief, and evidence. And it pushes us to think critically and engage with different perspectives, even ones that might be challenging.
And that's what makes this deep dive so valuable. It's not about picking sides or saying who's right and wrong. It's about understanding this complex issue better, seeing those subtle points that often get lost in all the arguing.
So for all you philosophy fans out there, we hope this is giving you some new things to think about and maybe even raise some new questions. The conversation about creationism, evolution, science, and religion isn't going away anytime soon.
And it's a conversation we all need to be a part of. It's about how we see the world, what our place in it is, and how we shape the future.
Welcome back to the deep dive, everyone. We've been on quite a journey, exploring the world of creationism and all its arguments and how it impacts how we think about science and religion. It's been fascinating.
Yeah, for sure. We've really dug deep from the historical roots of taking the Bible literally to the philosophical challenges that come with intelligent design.
And like we promised, in this last part of our deep dive, we're going to shift gears a bit and look at some of the newer stuff happening in this conversation. One thing that really stands out is the rise of these new atheists.
Oh, yeah, the new atheists.
Yeah.
Folks like Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, they've definitely made some waves.
They have, haven't they? They're known for, like, really going after religion. They say it's not only incompatible with science, but it's also a cause of irrationality, violence, and oppression.
Yeah, they've been very outspoken, writing best-selling books, giving popular lectures, all that. They challenge traditional religious beliefs and push for a secular worldview, one based on reason and evidence.
And they don't hold back either. They seem to really enjoy, like, taking on religious dogma head on. Sometimes they even use pretty provocative language.
Yeah, their approach has been pretty divisive, no doubt about it. I mean, a lot of people resonate with their arguments, especially folks who are disillusioned with organized religion or see it as an obstacle to scientific progress. But they've also gotten a lot of criticism.
Yeah, even from people who agree with them about, being skeptical of religious claims.
Right, exactly. Some critics say that their super aggressive style might actually backfire. It might alienate potential allies and just make the culture wars worse instead of encouraging any kind of meaningful conversation.
They've also been accused of pushing scientism, this idea that science is the only valid way to know anything and everything else is just, like, inferior.
That's a valid point, especially from a philosophical perspective. Science is a powerful tool for understanding the natural world, but
Yeah.
it's not the only way to know stuff, and it can't answer every question we have.
Especially questions about, values, morality, the meaning of life, all that stuff.
Exactly. If you reduce all knowledge to just science, you miss out on all the richness and complexity of being human.
So it seems like even though the new atheists have brought up some good points about, the dangers of religious extremism and the importance of critical thinking, Their way of going about it might be a bit too simple and divisive to really address the complicated relationship between science and religion.
A lot of scholars who are trying to find a more nuanced and constructive way to deal with this debate, they agree with that.
It's a good reminder that even within the scientific community, there are lots of different viewpoints on how science and religion should interact.
That's true. And that diversity of viewpoints is really important for having a healthy conversation. It's not about finding one right answer. It's about exploring all the complexities and promoting understanding and respect between different ways of knowing things.
And that brings us back to the core of what we've been talking about in this deep dive. This whole debate about creationism and evolution, it's not just a scientific or a religious thing, it's philosophical too.
It really is. It gets at these fundamental questions about, what is reality? Where did life come from? And what does it mean to be human?
It makes us think about our assumptions about knowledge, belief, evidence, all that. It challenges us to think critically and engage with different perspectives, even when they make us uncomfortable.
And I think that's the real takeaway from this deep dive. It's not about picking a side or saying who wins. It's about understanding this complex issue better and appreciating those nuances that often get lost when people are arguing.
So to all our listeners out there who are into philosophy, we hope this exploration has given you some new things to think about, maybe even spark some new questions. This conversation about creationism, evolution, science, and religion, it's definitely not over.
And it's a conversation that affects all of us. It shapes how we understand the world, how we find our place in it, and how we build the future.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of creationism. Keep those brains working, keep asking questions, and keep exploring the fascinating world where science, religion, and philosophy meet.